Hey guys, Tony Maritato here, licensed physical therapist, and in this video I want to share my 3 go-to ways that I look at determining, do I believe the condition is adhesive capsulitis, also known as frozen shoulder, or do I believe that there's a rotator cuff tear going on? Now, full disclosure, it absolutely could be both. You could have a rotator cuff tear, but that might not be what's causing your pain. You could have adhesive capsulitis in the absence or presence of a rotator cuff tear. So we need a medical diagnosis. You need to see a surgeon if you're dealing with significant pain and functional limitation. But the best thing that I think we can do is to start thinking about what might be going on now. So when you do see a surgeon, you've got information to discuss. Within my clinic, the criteria that I typically use is if somebody is strong within a certain range of motion, and that range of motion is specifically associated with the muscle function of the supraspinatus being probably the most common site of a rotator cuff tear, then I'm less inclined to think that the rotator cuff is torn, or if it is torn, that the tear is what's actually causing the pain and limitation. And so when we think of the supraspinatus muscle, it's the muscle right up here at the top. It's involved in taking the arm from by your side, which would be considered 0 degrees of abduction, to about 15 degrees of abduction. So this initial movement is what that muscle is actively working during. And so if I do that movement against resistance and I'm strong in a pain-free range of motion, there isn't as strong of a likelihood that the rotator cuff tendon is torn. Conversely, when we look at test number 2, this is looking at range of motion. I can have a torn rotator cuff, but pain-free range of motion. Whereas if I have adhesive capsulitis, a frozen shoulder, I can have strength, but very limited range of motion. By definition, a frozen shoulder is losing range of motion, losing motion into external rotation, internal rotation. So what we would do in the clinic in a physical therapy setting is we would test range of motion actively, we would test it passively. If I had frozen shoulder, I would be limited both actively and passively. But if I had a rotator cuff tear that was limiting my motion, I would have limited active range of motion, but I would be able to passively move through the positions relatively easily without restriction. So one of my favorite tests of the 3 is I want to know, can I passively move through the motion without limitation? That pretty much rules out adhesive capsulitis. And then of course the final one is, what was the mechanism of injury? If we're looking at a rotator cuff tear, we're typically looking at a traumatic mechanism of injury, meaning I fell off a ladder, I landed on my arm. I took my dog for a walk and he darted after a bunny rabbit and it yanked my arm and I felt like it almost pulled it out of socket. Like, those are consistent mechanisms of injury for a rotator cuff tear. But for adhesive capsulitis, it's probably more common that you notice some shoulder pain, you notice limited range of motion, you notice weakness because of the pain, not weakness in pain-free ranges of motion. And with time, it gradually got worse and worse and worse, but there was no actual event, no actual incident that initiated the symptoms. Just one day you realized your shoulder hurt. So these are kind of 3 tools that we use in the clinic to try to identify and differentiate whether we believe it is just a rotator cuff tear, truly a rotator cuff tear, just adhesive capsulitis, or a combination of the 2. And hopefully you guys find a physical therapist, an orthopedic surgeon that helps walk through the case history, because we know from imaging studies that imaging alone doesn't give us the full picture of what we think is going on. So guys, I hope this information was helpful. I'll catch you on the next video.